With Legend of the Sea Devils, the April 2022 special and penultimate 13th Doctor story, we have multiple layers to parse out in story and production. Every Doctor Who episode falls into one of these categories: science fiction, science fantasy, or pure fantasy, with an occasional episode in a fourth category, the historical drama, one that frequently incorporates science fantasy as well. Legend of the Sea Devils fits solidly into the fantasy category. We have fantastical adventures and mythical monsters, and while not strictly an historical story, it does place our fantasy story into an historical context with some historical characters. Within that framework, we have the continuation of the Yaz and Doctor romantic development, but since I have covered that in another video, I won't revisit those points here. This episode brings back the Sea Devils, the first time we have seen them on screen since the 5th Doctor episode, Warriors of the Deep, from the early 1980s. That episode also had Silurians, but will only focus on the presence of the Sea Devils and how they relate to Legend of the Sea Devils. We'll also include references from the first appearance of the Sea Devils in the 1972 story with a 3rd Doctor. Legend of the Sea Devils is also unique in its production style, with subtle nods to stylistic hallmarks of traditional Chinese stories. If you've watched any movies, television, or anime retelling of traditional Chinese stories, you'll recognize some similarities in the production values of Legend of the Sea Devils. Speaking of production, the indoor sets are impressive for Doctor Who, with a full-scale sailing ship recreated on the soundstage, along with several Sea Devil interior locations. Be sure to check out the detailed special feature short on the BBC Doctor Who YouTube channel. Not only are the sets impressive, but the quality of the lighting easily ranks on the top of the list for Doctor Who, if not claiming the top spot, especially for the scenes filmed on the sailing ship set. Let's get to it looking at those 5 components: fantasy storytelling and story structure, presentation style elements in modern retellings of traditional Chinese stories, scenic production choices, lighting design and its impact on delivery of the production, and the return of the Sea Devils. Our fantasy story starts with a mythical creature who was turned to stone or trapped in stone by a mystical gem, a gem we later learn can stop time and control your enemies. We also learn that this gem has infinite powers, can change the course of the world, freeze life and time, transport matter, entomb aggressors, and was created by the Sea Devils. Of course, there's swordplay and general swashbucklery throughout. We do get several on-screen sword fights, but all of the death happens off-screen. This may be just the BBC keeping things PG for the audience, but this stylization of fighting allows the viewer to focus on the fantasy story rather than on a hyper-realistic representation of fighting. These kinds of choices are also frequently used in the presentation of traditional storytelling, making fights and deaths on screen more stylized and mystical. Our Sea Devil leader appears and disappears in a cloud of mist multiple times. While the existence of the Sea Devils, along with their Silurian cousins, qualifies as science fiction or science fantasy, both are survivors from before the dinosaurs were wiped out, the way they are presented in this episode through the lens of fantasy storytelling tells us solidly what genre we are seeing on screen. That should change how we look at all the elements in the story, from script to performances to directing, editing, and special effects. We see gorgeous oceanic vistas when the TARDIS lands at the bottom of the ocean. Not only do we get a pirate story, but also one in relationship to life at the depths of the ocean floor. The Doctor, Yaz, and Ji-hun all get to swing from ship to ship via ropes, as well as perform other acrobatics and rope work while battling with the Sea Devils. The culmination of the story results in stars moving across the sky and the world being disrupted. This moment is presented as a magical event, not a scientifically driven phenomenon. Even though we know it is the work of the Sea Devils and their advanced technology, the way it is presented on screen and through this story makes this a magical fantasy trope that aligns directly with other Chinese mythological storytelling elements we will discuss shortly. Why do we care if a story is fantasy storytelling rather than science fiction, science fantasy, or historical storytelling? In order to answer that, I am going to segue into a quick segment on how to analyze creative work and how to know what tools and measures to use while doing so. If you choose the wrong tools and measures, you will likely find yourself discussing things in details that are absent from the creative work altogether, rather than discussing what is actually on the page or on the screen. If you analyze something without a shared foundation that is appropriately in alignment with the creative artists and their creative work, all you're going to do is make yourself unhappy, and all you're going to do for others is make them unhappy. So best to start out with a properly rooted foundation that is appropriate for and in alignment with the goals of the creative work that is being discussed. What was this creative work trying to do? Or what was this creative team or artist trying to do? This always must be your first step before applying critical analysis to any creative work. The second step will always be, how well did the creators of the work succeed at what they were trying to do? If you start a conversation comparing the creative work to your needs or expectations, then you are likely going to have very little to add to a discussion about the actual creative work, the artistic creation of the writers, directors, editors, performers, and other artisans. You are instead only having a one-sided discussion centered on yourself. Without a shared foundation between the approach to critical analysis and the creative work itself, your opinion is meaningless at best, and at worst, it is disrespectful to the creative artists and their work. Without a shared foundation, you are projecting yourself into the work, rather than fully receiving the work as envisioned and imagined by the creative team. If you ever find yourself saying, "It's not what I wanted, I was expecting something different," "It's not what it used to be," "It's not the story I want to see," or even blaming the writing for not meeting your needs or your expectations, then you haven't come to the discussion in good faith. Most likely, any complaint about the writing is really just code for, the writing isn't telling the stories that I want to hear, which ultimately means the complaint isn't about the writing at all, but rather it is about you not getting what you want. You haven't understood the creative work from within its own identity. You are forcing the creative work to live up to your expectations and to meet all of your terms of the relationship. The reality is you aren't the creator or the artist. You're an unhappy consumer. And ultimately, as an unhappy consumer, your thoughts and rants fall into the so what category. Time to better learn how to study and discuss the creative decisions that were made, rather than simply measuring your personal satisfaction through consumption of the creative work. Getting back to the trope of the Sea Devil's ability to manipulate the planet and its alignment within the solar system, if that technology doesn't come across as realistic enough or isn't explained scientifically enough for you, then you've probably not understood that this episode is Doctor Who fantasy, not Doctor Who science fiction. Likewise, if you are put off by some of the more fantastical or whimsical visual or production choices, you are probably missing out on the ways that this episode folds in elements and feel of contemporary storytelling tropes used on film and media as presented through a variety of traditional East Asian tales. If you aren't familiar with contemporary presentations of traditional Chinese stories, go back and watch Legend of the Sea Devils again and see how many subtle references to that kind of storytelling are layered within. If you weren't paying attention to that previously, you probably missed most of them. Surely this leap by our Sea Devil leader onto the moving, flying ship is very reminiscent of martial arts advanced skills as presented in many fantasy stories. Manipulating the air and the objects around them to make their bodies lighter than they are, to simulate flying and levitation and superheroic leaps. These are common among a particular genre of stories. Our Sea Devils from 1984 had samurai-inspired headgear, which might have influenced the choice to place a new Sea Devil story into an adjacent mythology. The flying ship that the Sea Devils use is simultaneously referencing stories of the Flying Dutchman, while also fitting in well with spiritual and magical beings that appear often in traditional Chinese stories. And of course, the Hua Shen. This mythological beast would fit in with many of the same stories. Is this an actual beast out of Chinese lore, or was it invented for Doctor Who? Shen could refer to any number of dragons or aquatic beasts in mythic lore. On screen, we see elements of dinosaur-like fins and reptilian ancestry. Glimpses of the beast also show it has design elements common to Chinese dragon forms as depicted throughout history. Even the dragon's movement is like that of many Chinese dragons. We are even introduced to an actual historical figure, the pirate Madame Ching, and a lost treasure from the Flor Delamar ship from 400 years earlier. Our story creates other fictional characters. Sin Ji Hun, the captain who parlayed with the Sea Devils after recovering the lost treasure as his own. Ying Qi, the descendant of Lei Bao, who fled the ship hundreds of years ago and stopped the Sea Devils, imprisoning them in the statue. There was also an historic rivalry between the Red Flag fleet of Madame Ching and the Black Flag fleet of Guo Podai, though there is no mention of capturing and ransoming Madame Ching's sons as part of historical records. Overlooking the directorial and stylistic choices that layered in references, reflections, and refractions of traditional Chinese stories completely misses a huge chunk of the creative framework that supports this story. The BBC team are proud of the details that went into the pirate ship set. Go watch the short behind-the-scenes video on the BBC Doctor Who YouTube channel. They put an impressive amount of detail into the ship's design, enough to have full-scale environments for all the performers, including functional sailing components, full-sized sails rigged overhead, and the ability to include live-action rope work, sword fighting, and other stunts. They added cultural design elements and dressed the set to work for two separate sailing ships, both Madame Ching's ship and Ji Hun's ship, the latter which also served as the Flying Dutchman that the Sea Devils commanded. Additional sets were fabricated to create below-deck locations on Ji Hun's ship. Once the ship is modified with Sea Devil technology to enable it to levitate and fly, the below-deck locations are expanded to include control stations as well as a stasis chamber for Ji Hun. Does anyone think it's curious that all the Sea Devil control stations are shaped like TARDIS consoles? Is this something we should look more closely at, as some sort of Easter egg? We also get multiple locations that are part of the underwater Sea Devil base. While these are given less attention, with general seaweed-like drapery everywhere to suggest aquatic influence technology, the added locations do present original designs, machinery, and specific environmental lighting. Overall, the scenic production on this episode ranks in the very top of recent seasons, both due to the scale of the physical sets and because of the superior lighting design that shaped the performers on the stages. The lighting design is perhaps the most impressive we have ever seen on a Doctor Who episode, including contemporary Who and classic Who. One of the biggest challenges for a lighting designer is to create the illusion of realistic sculptural light to suggest an outdoor environment while actually being in the studio. In this case, I suspect the collaboration of scenic, costume, and lighting design teams in tandem with a directorial style that incorporated fantasy and traditional storytelling visual tropes created the perfect mix for all the pieces to fit together so well. We have three distinct lighting looks while the crew are on board Madame Ching's ship. The first look presents an overcast day. Beautiful layering of light on the faces of the performers suggests this was filmed outdoors on a proper ship, while also remaining fully within the world of stylistic storytelling of this particular place and time. Lighting an indoor set to be an outdoor location is hard enough. Lighting it to appear realistic outdoor lighting while also maintaining a stylistic approach is even harder. When the Hua Shen attacks, the overcast sky changes to one resembling dusk, and the sculptural light on the performers changes to match. At the peak of the attack, the lighting achieves a look resembling what one would expect during an eclipse. We move from overcast through dusk into the supernatural time of an eclipse. The eclipse has frequently been used in fantasy adventure stories as a significant storytelling marker of a momentous, potentially world-ending event. When we arrive at the denouement, after the Doctor has fixed things and locked the Sea Devils in their own world for the next several hundred years, the sky's clear and we now have sunny sky aboard Madame Ching's ship for the first time. That makes 3 successful key outdoor lighting looks performed on a studio stage. That's pretty impressive and likely something few people other than a lighting designer might notice. The final look on board the ship also reminds us of some of the ways traditional Chinese stories have been presented on screen. Well lit to focus on the performances in the story, rather than to obscure everything in mood lighting. Not quite a full-on Brechtian approach to storytelling, but with some connections to that style of performance. Not only do each of these various lighting looks succeed in what was required of the time and locations, but they also reflect a conceptual arc that parallels the story, with skies becoming overcast as the core conflict develops, turning into the strangely supernatural lighting of an eclipse as the Sea Devil's plan climaxes, only to revert to sunny and clear skies when all is realigned with the resolution. A classic fantasy fairy tale story arc reflected fully through the lighting design. The Sea Devil prosthetics are simply incredible. Some of the best Doctor Who has done in recent years, way beyond anything they had in Classic Who. In Classic Who, the Sea Devils were largely mocked for their stiff, slow movements and not being much more than a performer in a mask. But here they have articulating gills and nostrils and are tall and ominous from their very first appearance. These Sea Devils are skilled in swordplay and quite nimble despite their size. Their leader is able to leap onto the moving, flying ship, very reminiscent of martial arts advanced skills in fantasy storytelling. This branch of the Sea Devils is also likely influenced by their last on-screen appearance in the 5th Doctor story, Warriors of the Deep. In that story, the Sea Devils are reactivated and resuscitated by their Silurian cousins. The Sea Devils in 1984 are wearing helmets with samurai-influenced designs. That suggests that there may be a strong presence of Sea Devils in the various Asian regions. It could be why this story is set in a Chinese fantasy and historical moment, to try and make some connection to that particular classic Doctor Who story. In fact, this story from the 1800s could be a prehistory of the exact same Sea Devils that are resuscitated in Warriors of the Deep, trapped at the bottom of the ocean by the 13th Doctor in the 1800s, only to be revived by the Silurians in 2084. If this is the case, the new design of the Sea Devils, bringing back some of their attire from their 1972 appearance with the 3rd Doctor and mixing it with Chinese and other Asian culture, could be Chibnall's attempt to retcon their poor presentation in 1984. Similarly, the Merca from the 1984 episode will always be one of the saddest monster attempts from that time period, and to be able to redo that with the Hua Shen Beast in Legend of the Sea Devils could be another attempt to re-envision a low point in Classic Who. Is the Sea Devils' new ability to travel on mists unique to this branch of Sea Devils? Or is it unique to this particular story because of the ties to fantasy tropes as well as mythological elements from the Chinese stories? We never get an on-screen explanation, but it does fit in nicely with fantasy storytelling, mysterious and magical means of transportation. Despite the amazingly produced prosthetics, monster makeup, costumes, and design, I am sure plenty of fans are going to complain about the limited mobility and articulation of the Sea Devils' faces and mouths while speaking. Since the Sea Devils are the aquatic cousin to their land-dwelling Silurians, they must also have biology that supports full aquatic habitation if needed, as well as the ability to survive on land. They are a blend of amphibian, aquatic, and reptile. I don't know any aquatic, amphibian, or reptilian creature that has an articulating mouth and lips to be able to form them into the words the way primates do. So how do they speak? Let's look at their necks and nostrils to try to figure that out. The designers have focused quite a bit on the subtle articulating areas that suggest gill-like organs. How much of their communication is with mammal-like vocal cords? Maybe they don't have anything like that at all. Perhaps it is simultaneously a physical sound and a telepathic form of communication. And ultimately, how does the TARDIS translation matrix impact the Sea Devil's natural language? Don't go too far down this rabbit hole though, because then we will be wondering why or how the TARDIS translates the language of Jihan, Yingqi, Madame Ching, and that of the Sea Devils. Those are not under the influence of the TARDIS translation matrix. Maybe the Sea Devils also have advanced universal translator technology themselves. Remember, this is a fantasy telling of a Doctor Who adventure, and not every detail must have a traceable scientific explanation behind it. Let it go and start enjoying the story as it was meant to be, as fantasy Doctor Who.